I'm Sarah Fensky, and this is the 314. Every episode, we sit down with St. Louisans who know what makes this place tick. Together, we explore why things are the way they are and how we can make them better. This episode of the 314 podcast is sponsored by St. Louis Art Museum's Corporate Partner Program. Earlier this spring, Missouri Governor Mike Kehoe signed a bill that returned control of the St. Louis Police to a board he appoints. I was openly critical of that decision. Having a state official from a different party than the city's leadership take charge of a key city department felt wrong to me. And the fact that St. Louis and Kansas City are the only big cities in the country under such an arrangement made me even more skeptical. Former journalist Christine Byers has a more nuanced take. She covered the police beat for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch from 2009 to 2019, and then another 4 years at KSDK. That period included a previous transition when the department moved from state control to the city's management in 2012. And what this longtime reporter had to say about state control challenged my assumptions. We also talked, of course, about journalism and her decision last spring to leave it. Christine Byers, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So to many of us in the city, the state taking control of the police department feels like a slap in the face. But you've lived through state control, and you're telling me it wasn't a bad thing. Really? For real here?
Well, I would say from a reporter's perspective, it was certainly much different than local control. So when I first started covering the city police department, it was under state control, which is a citizen-led board appointed by the governor, and then the mayor sits on the board as well.
And this was back in 2009?
Correct. And so, once a month, I would basically go in along with the rest of the St. Louis Press Corps into St. Louis Police Headquarters, and we would listen to a board meeting. And part of this board meeting was, it always started off with a crime stats rundown by the police chief. And it was interesting to watch the dynamic between these civilian board members, sort of pressing the police chief on all of these different statistics and getting answers to their questions and that sort of thing. And in addition to that, as reporters, we would get a police board packet, which was about an inch thick worth of papers and the agenda items. And so we could read through things like proposed contracts for different police services and all kinds of things, different police training classes. So it really gave, as a reporter, a window into the inner operations of the police department. And my favorite part of the board meetings was, of course, guaranteed access. I mean, every board meeting, the police chief was there, all the top brass was there. You had access to these civilian board members. Now, in fairness, I should say, some of these civilian police board members were more accessible than others. I distinctly remember going to ask some of them for comments and sometimes being told, you need to speak to the police department media relations people. And to which those people, the media relations people, would respond to me and say, we're the spokespeople for the department.
Yeah, they didn't speak for the board members.
Right.
So there was kind of that runaround.
There would still be a runaround. So I don't want to paint this as all hearts and rainbows, certainly, that, the state board was fully transparent at all. I wouldn't say that at all. But I would say it just gave much more of a window as a reporter and, there again, the public, in access to the inner workings of the police department and access to the decision makers. And even if the answer from those decision makers was, you have to speak to our media relations people, that's what I would put in my article so people could see what was happening when the public, a member of the public, would ask a question and it wouldn't get answered and why it wouldn't get answered.
And the chiefs of police would be at these board meetings to take questions from the board members or to try to explain what was in these reports. Was that also a chance to talk to them then?
Very illuminating. Absolutely. Just the dynamic between them and the board. And then after the meetings, we all had access to the police chief immediately. So we could ask our questions on a monthly basis. And, when I was still with Channel 5, it took a full year before Chief Tracy would grant any of my requests for interviews.
And this was much later. This is after the department switched over to reporting to the mayor. You later left the Post-Dispatch and went to KSDK. At that point, you found it much harder to get that kind of access?
Well, truly, my focus on covering the police department once the state board was eliminated really focused on developing sources within the police department, because suddenly that, 1 inch thick packet of information about the different contracts and the different trainings and all of the different things that would show in the budgets was gone. And so it really forced me as a reporter to sort of dig deep and build my source base. So it just was a matter of adjustment, but anymore with the way media is, that is a very difficult skill to develop.
That feels like the thing young reporters don't get the time to do.
Exactly, because, long ago or long gone are the days of the beat reporters per se, because anymore so many reporters have to be all over the place all the time. So building sources takes a lot of time and a lot of resources. So I was fortunate that I was able to sort of shift gears, but it was very apparent to me immediately once the police board was gone that I absolutely needed to work on developing sources within the department, higher ranking, even lower ranking. And I also, it also varied with police chiefs. When, local control took effect, the police chief was Sam Dotson. And I was able to kind of sort of pave a path for myself with him and say, hey, I'm a little concerned that these police board meetings are going away. I would still like to have regular contact with you. So he kept a monthly appointment with me to where I could just ask him anything. But certainly then when the next chief came in and the next chief came in, I mean, that changed, so it was variable upon administration. So I think it's going to be very interesting to watch this new dynamic.
It seems like this could all come down to who is on the board. Do they have the city's best interest at heart? I can't help but wonder if things were different back when you began working as a police reporter, because at that point, we had Governor Jay Nixon was the governor, a very different dynamic between the city and the state. And I think part of what has so many of us city residents alarmed is it feels like the state maybe doesn't have our best interests at heart. When you were there covering it, this had been something that had been in place since 1861. It was sort of this long-standing tradition. Yes. It didn't feel personal, like control had been yanked away.
Correct. Absolutely. And I distinctly remember, thinking to myself, and I'm a city resident as well, and I distinctly remember thinking to myself, how is it that this board can really have the city's best interests at heart when they're governed by the state and the governor? And I remember Mayor Slay at the time fighting so hard to get control of the police department. And I would think to myself, why in the world would this mayor or any mayor want control of the police department? Because then anything to do with crime stats and crime in the city falls at your feet. And I thought, he has the perfect excuse now if something's going wrong with the police department or crime is out of control to be like, oh, sorry, I don't run the police department. You can talk to the governor about that. But he was adamant about getting control of the police department. And it was very interesting to see that all finally happen. And it took forever, as you know.
He fought for that hard, and it ended up going to a statewide vote. That's how the city got it back. It's fascinating that barely lasted a decade. One of the reasons I think it went away is that the officers were very outspoken about they wanted this. Here's a quote from the Ethical Society of Police that represents the Black officers on the force. Quote, having worked under both systems, we're confident that this is the start of the path to much needed improvements that will benefit law enforcement, civilian workers, and the citizens of our great city. And they're a recommendation for going back to state control. What have been some of the gripes that you've heard from your sources that they preferred state control to what happened in the decade plus that it was under city control?
Certainly, I think the main concern has been the, believe it or not, the administrative role. They were just very underwhelmed with the way that the city ran everything from personnel to payroll to it was a very clunky transition was what I was hearing. And also I think philosophically at this point is where we're at. I mean, certainly, the governor currently, as they say, they call it pro-police. I hate that term, but definitely more in favor of giving police more resources and law and order and that sort of approach. Whereas city leadership in recent years, certainly under the Tashara Jones administration, definitely was not prioritizing police resources. I mean, you saw the 911 center just completely decimated. You saw the numbers of the police officers just absolutely dwindle to numbers I certainly never thought I would see covering the city. And so the focus just wasn't there. And when you have a Republican-led state administration, that is much more appealing to officers who definitely feel abandoned, underappreciated, and those things. So I think the philosophy and the timing of that is what made this happen.
I think if you talk to Mayor Tashara Jones' administration, she would say she got some big raises for these police officers. These contracts that the city signed off on in the last couple of years were pretty good. It didn't really seem to do much to change that feeling that the police felt somewhat beleaguered. Was your sense that they were threatened by some of these new models of policing that she was trying to do? She wanted to have social workers take some calls. She wanted to do more violence interrupted, not just lock them up type stuff.
Sure. I think that the officers on the ground, at least from what I was hearing, at the time, was that those things just weren't working because they weren't effectively implemented. So I think that was the difference. Lots of promises were made, but when the rubber met the road, they really just weren't turning out quite as promised. And in the meantime, again, the rank and file is dwindling, and races only go so far. I mean, if you're out there and there's only one other car in the district, I don't care how much you're getting paid. I would think that could be quite defeating and intimidating and dangerous. I mean, it was officer safety, and it was incredible to see the levels that the ranks got to. Now, to be fair, of course, there are officer shortages across the country. This is not something unique to the city. But certainly under the Jones administration, the police did not feel at all like they were prioritized and given all of the resources that they needed to try to recruit new officers. Again, the focus, going to the social programming and things like that, but the implementation just wasn't there.
Our guest today on the 314 podcast is Christine Byers. She covered the police beat for the Post-Dispatch from 2009 to 2019. She stayed on the beat at KSDK from 2020 to 2024. We'll return to our conversation in just a moment, but first, a word from our sponsor. Make a real impact in your community and boost your business by becoming a corporate partner of the St. Louis Art Museum. Through the Corporate Partner Program, you'll support free, year-round programs and help bring over 125,000 people closer to the arts and to each other. Plus, your investment contributes to strengthening St. Louis as a regional center for economic growth and talent attraction. Learn more at SLAM.org. And now back to our conversation with Christine Byers, longtime police reporter, today works as the marketing director for the Simon Law Firm, but just has a real depth and breadth of knowledge about what has happened in policing in St. Louis in the last decade and a half. Christine, part of what has made me skeptical about the idea of the police reporting to a board as opposed to just reporting to the mayor has a certain sort of visibility. We know what they're up to, what their goals are, who their relatives are. It feels like to have 5 or 6 people on a board, they may want favors from a police department. And that is something I feel that history kind of bears out that I know what I'm talking about here. Yeah. Tell us about the scandal that involved the Bomarito family, famous for owning Tony's restaurant, which of course recently closed. And I guess it was Vince Bomarito who was on the police board.
Correct. So the police board was not certainly without its tarnishes. And Vince Bomarito basically had a relative who had become a little bit inebriated. This is going back. I believe it was St. Patrick's Day.
And a great St. Louis tradition.
Of course.
Getting inebriated on St. Patrick's Day.
Yes, indeed. And got into some trouble with the police department and I believe had parked in a certain area they weren't supposed to, and then was irate when told to move, something like along those lines, and was arrested. And yes, Mr. Bomarito called in a favor to the police department that he was, in control of partially, and things were made to accommodate that whole situation.
So the family member got some special treatment.
Exactly. And so that was a big scandal at the time.
How did this come to light?
Now that because sources, I mean, sources within the police department were appalled, and they were wanting to expose that for happening. And there was also, to be fair, a strong movement afoot to get rid of the state board at the time. So any scent of a scandal whatsoever was just ripe for being leaked at the time. So yeah, absolutely, that was what happened. And it was, just an effort to say, hey, look, here, this is why we can't have the state board. Now, then it was interesting because then when the arguments turned in favor of getting city control, everybody thought, and everybody would say, the opponents would say, you thought the state board was bad. Wait till you get the board of aldermen involved. I mean, imagine all the favors they're going to be calling in and that sort of thing.
Yeah, someone's always going to try to call in a
Sure.
favor. I guess the question is, when would the pressure get to a police chief? Is he going to be more intimidated by the Board of Aldermen? Is he going to be more intimidated by the state board? When you saw the dynamic there between the chiefs that you worked with and the state board, did you get the sense that they were genuinely interested in good policing for the city, or were they looking out for their own interests?
I think that they were always pushing the agenda of the governor that appointed them. And so it was interesting to watch the different dynamics, too, of appointees that were left over from the previous administration and that sort of thing. And then there were also board members who aligned themselves politically with the mayor. And Mayor Slay, to his credit, was pretty savvy at, talking to these board members and getting them on his side.
He would schmooze them.
Oh, absolutely. And you would see some of the votes go in, that way. And you would know as soon as so-and-so voted one way, okay, well, that's the rest of the, Mayor Slay's side is going to go with this. And we know how this is going to go. So he did the best he could, certainly. And I also remember a very heated exchange between Mayor Slay and then Governor Nixon during all of the, fighting to get control of the police department. It was interesting to watch. It was at a police foundation banquet. So, everybody's dressed to the nines and it's in a beautiful location. It's a huge fundraiser for the police department. And here's Mayor Slay just going right up to Governor Nixon and having a very heated conversation. Wish I could have heard it.
So people saw it, but they couldn't hear it.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, man. I wonder what that was about.
I know. But it was at a contentious time in the wrestle for state control and local control and that sort of thing. And then I would also add, the St. Louis County Police Department right now, and for as long as I've known the county police department, which formed it back in the 50s, they have a citizen-led police board structure. And what's different, though, is those board members are appointed by the county executive. So it's a lot more closer to local control. But it's interesting to also have a civilian board structure oversee that police department, because same thing as a reporter, you get a police board packet, you get access to the meetings, you get access then to the top brass and these police board members, and you get to a little peek behind the inner workings of the police department.
So that's almost a hybrid model. You retain the local control, but there's a board there instead. It's interesting. So the way that this bill that was passed, it moves very quickly in giving the governor control of the St. Louis Police again. He has to appoint 5 commissioners. 4 of them will be voting members. The mayor also gets a seat and is a voting member. They have to be a city resident for 2 years. They can't hold elected or appointed office. Those are the only restrictions. As you say, sometimes it came down to the personalities that were on this board. I think it's going to be really revealing to see who Governor Kehoe picks.
Oh, it's going to be extremely revealing. I mean, I just wonder who he's going to go to, and is it going to be a diverse board of diverse perspectives, or is it going to be all, people that are going to sort of rubber stamp anything that the police chief wants? And that can certainly happen. Or is this going to be, like I said, sort of diverse opinions that are really going to pick apart the police chief's requests and things like that? So under state control also, there was some tension between the police chief and the mayor, because essentially the police chief didn't have to listen to the mayor and could ask the police board for whatever they wanted and whatever initiatives they wanted and that sort of thing. So that was a very difficult dynamic for the mayor's office to navigate.
You can see why Mayor Francis Slay fought so hard to get that control.
Because to the normal citizen also, it didn't matter that the police department was under state control. If crime was out of control and things were not going well with the police department, it was still the mayor's fault. So politically, it was a problem for the mayor to watch decisions being made that he or she didn't agree with. It was all he at the time. And he would watch these decisions being made. He would feel like this could be very damaging politically to him when he's out and about in the community and people are asking him about the police department. Like I said, the average person, it doesn't matter who's running the police
They
board.
don't think of it that way.
Correct. They always think of the mayor as that's where the buck stops.
So, Christine Byers, we've been talking a lot about the police department, and this was an area that you covered for so long. But in our final couple minutes here, I did just want to ask you a couple questions about the work you did as a journalist, because I imagine in the 10 years that you covered the police, it wasn't just the department that changed, it was the media that changed. And then you left print journalism, went to TV. That was a big change. As you look back on your career and look back on what's happened to media, what's sort of your prevailing emotion thinking about that?
It really is sad and troubling to look back and remember the newsroom I walked into in 2006 at the Post-Dispatch and see already at that time, the paper had gone through its first buyout and the selling from the Pulitzer family to Lee Enterprises. And I was told the paper was, decimated, that there's so many staff members that took the buyouts and, the glory days are over. And me as a 26-year-old reporter walking in that newsroom, I'd been to 3 other papers that were, a third of the size of the Post-Dispatch at that time. I thought I had really hit the big time. And I thought the newsroom was huge. And the number of staff was absolutely enormous. And to look at the staff now, I mean, just the other day, I went to the staff contact us page at the Post-Dispatch and was just looking over the names, and it's incredible how few are left. And, the smaller papers that I worked at anymore have like a staff of 1 or 2. So it's very, very sad. I mean, and at Channel 5, they're still continuing to do more with less. And the demands on reporters today, as I alluded to a little earlier, really make it almost impossible to develop those source-based relationships that really take time to develop, and trust needs to be built in order to sort of infiltrate these institutions and bring true transparency and shine a light on what's actually going on. And that is so troubling to me. It is so sad to watch, and I sit here saying that as one that walked away from it, myself.
You chose to leave.
I did. And, the decision was just better for me and my family. I have a son with special needs, and it was just, as there were more demands, my job, my work never stopped. The phone never stopped ringing, with tips and things and that. And it was fantastic. Don't get me wrong. There's nothing like it. And I miss it every day. But just from a personal standpoint, this schedule is much better. Frankly, the money, of course, is always a nice thing. But I mean, that goes to show that the resources for journalism are dwindling so much that when you reach a certain point in your career and in your life, you think, gosh, I know I should be making more, and I know that there's something more I could be doing out there. It was a very difficult decision, absolutely, because I'm still passionate about journalism to this day, and I try to do everything I can to help shine a light on what's going on in our community through the law firm that I work for, because they do some amazing work and some amazing cases. And I really believe in the mission, and Simon Law was one of my best sources when I was on the police and crime beat.
Yeah.
They handle a lot of cases that sort of align, along those lines. And so it is a really good fit for me because I truly believe in the causes that they take on. And so I'm very pleased with where I landed.
And I know you're still trying to get stories out. That's part of the work that you do with the Simon Law Firm. But at the same time, as you say, reporters today just don't have time to build those sources the way that it was your job to build those sources back in the day. Do you think there are important stories that are going untold because people just aren't finding out about them?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, sitting at Simon Law and knowing some of the cases we're working on at this very moment.
Cases that you can't talk about yet.
And and I tell the lawyers I work with all the time, I say, guys, I really think we should get in front of this. I really think we should get out to the media with this. And there's always strategy, of course, from the legal perspective on when is best to, make a press release and talk publicly about a case. And I've said from time to time, I don't want to be in a reactive position because there are reporters out there who are checking the dockets and they're going to find out about these things. And anymore, I'm finding that isn't necessarily the case where I'm sitting here thinking, okay, my phone's going to be ringing. I know someone's going to find this case and I'm going to have to react. And it's just not happening. I mean, some of these stories are just right out there in plain sight, but nobody's looking.
Well, I'm going to end on that sobering note today. Christine Byers, I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarah. I appreciate the chance to reminisce about the good old days.
And sometimes the bad old days.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
That was Christine Byers, who covered the St. Louis Police Department for 14 years with the Post-Dispatch and then KSDK. She is now the director of marketing for the Simon Law Firm. In just a moment, Ryan Kroll joins us for the closer. But first, a word from our sponsor. This episode of the 314 podcast is supported by the Missouri History Museum. St. Louis employers take pride in their city. Share that excitement with your team, whether they're new to the Lou or lifelong locals, and take part in the New to St. Louis STL 101 tour from the Missouri Historical Society. Hear from local history experts, explore neighborhoods, oddities, and landmarks, and then wrap it up with a happy hour featuring iconic St. Louis foods and local beers. Who knew team building could be this much fun? Book your tour today at mohistory.org/STL101. And now for the closer. Catholics around the country celebrated as last week's conclave in Rome ended with the selection of the first ever pope from the United States. And Pope Leo XIV isn't just from the Midwest. He also spent a year in St. Louis. And that's something my colleague Ryan Kroll has had some fun exploring. And Ryan joins us now to tell us all about it. Ryan, welcome.
Hey, good to be here. I think I'll have fun talking about it right now as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. So you actually got inside the Pope's former residence last week. How did that happen?
Yeah, I guess just to back up a little bit, I should say, I know next to nothing about the Pope or Catholicism. So I'm not, on the one hand, I'm not the best guy to talk about this. However, I do think I have a pretty good sense about what is or isn't good for St. Louis. And I think it was on Thursday when they announced this guy as the new Pope. Of course, like any journalist in town worth their salt, I Google his name followed by St. Louis. And lo and behold, something actually came up. And I was very, very excited about that.
I remember this. You were very excited.
Yes. Yeah. It's always great when an international story has a local angle. So that's really exciting. But anyway, yeah, so he did about a year in this church, parish in what is now the Gate District. At the time, I think it was Compton Heights, but it's on Laclede Avenue.
Or on Lafayette.
Oh, Lafayette. Laclede. Sorry, yeah, Lafayette. Appreciate that. Well, it's not a church anymore. It's still you can kind of see its grandeur. It still looks really beautiful. And Pat, who owns Das Bevo and the Boocat Club, he is busy renovating it, and he kind of has this idea to turn it into like a bar and restaurant and event space, or he's also happy to sell it. So it's currently on the market.
There's not just this beautiful old former church. There's also this rectory where the now Pope lived for a year when he was a novice. Mm-hmm. And so you managed to talk Pat Schuchard, the rehabber who owns this building. You managed to talk him into letting you into the building.
Yeah. So the church, I should say, it's really beautiful, even though it's sort of fallen on hard times. The stained glass is like amazing, and it's just a sort of grand sort of a building with like a great sort of faded elegance. The rectory, on the other hand, is a little more sort of just like nuts and bolts. It's a 10-bedroom house. It looks like a lot of kind of houses in South City, in that, there's wood floors and these sort of exposed radiators. But like it's also very sort of plain and unadorned. I guess it looks like the type of place where you'd have like quiet religious reflection. But yeah, anyway, this is where Pope Leo spent about a year of his life in the 1970s. And you mentioned he was a novice, which my understanding is this is like when you're trying to decide whether or not you want to basically devote your life to the church. So presumably, like, it was in this building in St. Louis where the current Pope decided that he was all in on the religious life, which is pretty, I think, pretty cool. Whether or not you're Catholic, I don't know how do you, I should be asking you, how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think it's pretty cool. I actually went down there myself after you went and did this great report on last Friday. I went down to check this out because it's interesting to tread where the current Pope once trod. And, you kind of have this cool feeling of maybe, this is where he sort of felt this call being cemented. I found myself thinking a lot about this neighborhood. I live very close to there, and they cut I-44 through this neighborhood before the years that the Pope would have been there. And if you talk to neighbors, it was almost a catastrophic thing that happened. It sort of cut the neighborhood in two. A lot of people ended up leaving. There was also a lot of white flight happening in the city at that point. And my sense is that the year that he lived there, 1977, this was a year that neighborhood would have been pretty down on its luck. And now there's been a lot of interest. You see a lot of young families putting down roots, new townhouses almost across the street, guys like Pat Schuchard that really know what they're doing, buying in. But I imagine this was not St. Louis at its finest. And I love that this kind of led him further down this path of wanting to be a priest. Yeah,
you never know. If the town had been firing on all cylinders, maybe he wouldn't be the Pope right now. I do, call me like a wild-eyed optimist, but I do feel like this will be sort of like a slight tourism boon for the town. And like in my sort of universe, the analogy I think of, like, okay, if it came to light that like Bob Dylan had spent a very formative year in St. Louis that we were heretofore unaware of, I'd be like, yeah, whatever apartment he was in, that's like a place that's going to have a lot of importance and is going to draw like a non-trivial amount of people every year. So I have to imagine it's going to be the same case here. So it's just sort of an exciting thing, and it's a great little thing for our city.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Pope's boyhood home in the Chicago suburbs was just pure coincidence. It was for sale at the moment that this announcement was made, and they apparently immediately got a number of offers. They took it off the market. They're obviously going to see now how good of an offer they can get. Do you know if Pat has heard a similar amount of interest?
Well, when I talked to him, the news was pretty fresh, and he was sort of cool on the whole thing. But I think he's just sort of a cool customer in general. But he did have some fun with it. He said, we'll have to make up one of the beds and say that Pope Leo left it just this way, 48 years ago, that kind of thing. And I think the other thing that we have going for us is that, there's a lot of like really important people who have like strong ties to St. Louis, like Chuck Berry and people in that kind of echelon. But then there's a lot of other sort of really important people who have like a kind of more tenuous connection to our town. But I feel like we're really good at kind of making the most of that tenuous.
We claim those people.
Yeah. So I think that's going to give us a little bit of an edge here, and I really hope it like sort of rebounds to Pat's, and everyone else's favor.
Well, St. Louis Magazine staff writer Ryan Kroll, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Sarah Fensky, and that's the 314 for today. You can find out more in our podcast show notes and at stlmag.com. You can also find me every day in your inbox. That's thanks to St. Louis Magazine's fantastic free newsletter, St. Louis Daily. It's a fresh take on St. Louis with insight and original reporting, stories just like the one Ryan Kroll just discussed. You can sign up at stlmag.com/newsletters. The 314 is a production of St. Louis Magazine. I'm Sarah Fensky, and this is The 314. See you next time.